Hello, my fellow chocolate lovers. Um, we're going to continue the chocolate touch. Um, we left off in kind of an intense moment. So John was practicing, and his instrument turns completely to chocolate, and the whole band is laughing at him, and John is completely upset, and he doesn't understand what's going on, and he runs out of there. So let's continue to find out what poor John is going to do. Oh, the shame of it, the humiliation. John wept breathlessly as he ran, shocked and frightened, indignant and angry at the world that had suddenly turned against him. Mean old things, John thought, blaming Miss Plimsoll and Miss Quaver for his failures, even though nothing that had happened to him had been their fault in any way. Horrible school day, he thought, even though he had liked school until that morning. Hateful Susan, he thought, even though he knew at the same time that he was really longing for her to be friendly with him again. Through the window, Mrs. Midas saw John coming up the pathway. "Hello, John dear," she called from the living room. "You're home early today. How nice. As a reward, there'll be a piece of chocolate after supper." "I hate it!" John shouted. He was crying too hard to say anything else for a moment. When she heard the sound of his voice, Miss Midas rushed into the hall. "Why, what's the matter, dear?" she asked, putting her arm around him. John twisted away from her grasp, ran past her, and started up the stairs toward his bedroom. "Susan doesn't want me at her birthday party," he said as he went. "I know she doesn't. Well, I don't want to go to her rotten old party anyway." "I don't think you really mean that," Mrs. Midas said. "Besides," she added, and John was halted by the softness of her voice, "Mrs. Buttercup just telephoned to say she was going to drive over herself at 4 o'clock to pick you up." "She did?" John said, blinking down at his mother from the top of the stairway. "Yes, she did," Mrs. Midas assured him. "So you'd better hurry and get yourself washed and brushed. Your party clothes are laid out on your bed." There were games on the Buttercup's lawns while it was still warm enough outside. Later, the party supper, including the birthday cake, was going to be served indoors, and there would be a magician and a short movie. John joined in the blind man's buff, and grandmother's footsteps, and fox and geese, and soon he became more cheerful. He even temporarily forgot about chocolate. Susan looked very pretty. Her yellow curls had been brushed so hard that they looked silkier than ever. She was wearing a bright blue ribbon, the same color as her eyes. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, a deeper pink than her new party dress. On her feet were dainty little white socks and white shoes with straps that buttoned. Between games, Susan smiled at John and said, "I'm glad you came." They seemed to be on good terms again. Then Mr. Buttercup approached, bringing a bucket of water from the garage. He set it down in the middle of the lawn without spilling a single drop. "We are going to duck for apples," Susan whispered in John's ear, whispered to John. "The boys against the girls. You can be captain of the boys' team." The two teams lined up for the race, Susan leading the girls and John the boys. "The idea is this," Mr. Buttercup explained. "When I say go, not yet, John, Susan and John will run to the bucket. There are 12 apples floating in the bucket and 12 people in the race. Using only their teeth, Susan and John will grab their apples and run back to their lines. As soon as they touch the hands of the number 2 runners in their teams, Denny and Duncan, Susan and John will go to the end of their lines, and Denny and Duncan will run to the bucket and duck for apples. Do you all understand the way it's going to work? All right. 1 to get ready, 2 to get steady, and 3 to go!" Susan bounded ahead like a jackrabbit and had her face deep in the bucket by the time John reached her side and crouched down for his apple. He got his eye on a big red one with its stalk jutting up conveniently for him to grab. He lowered his face, opened his mouth, and lunged. Somehow his nose reached the apple before his teeth did and pushed it below the surface of the water. John's mouth followed the apple down. Then a terrible thing happened. The clear water in the bucket turned into dark brown sweet liquid chocolate. Susan and John immediately pulled their heads up, but it was too late. Their faces were drenched with chocolate syrup. "Oh!" Susan exclaimed, wiping chocolate off her eyes. Chocolate syrup dripped down all over her delicate pale pink dress. "Oh!" she moaned. John was in the same state. There was chocolate all over his face. There was chocolate on his white shirt front and on his gray flannel shorts, and there was chocolate in his mouth. "Glug," John said. "Glug." Susan was too surprised and angry to speak. For the second time that day, she turned her back on John and ran away from him. Mrs. Buttercup offered to clean John up, but he couldn't bear to stay at the party another minute. He started off at once for home. Oh, poor John. Chapter 10. For Sale. Dragging along and thinking of all the dreadful things that had happened, John had walked about halfway home when he heard a cheery voice of his father. "Hello, hello!" called Mr. Midas, crossing over from the other side of the street. He was on his way home from the station. "You left the party rather early, didn't you?" "What?" John Midas had seen the patches and streaks of chocolate that were drying on John's face and on his clothes. "Good gracious!" he said. "No wonder you left the party early. How did that happen?" John burst into tears. It had all been so awful, but now he could tell his father about his terrible day. He stopped crying and only sniffed a little now and then as he told the whole story, about taking the coin to the candy store, about buying the box that had turned out to have only one chocolate in it, about the toothpaste, about breakfast, the gloves, the silver dollar, the pencil, the lunch, the trumpet, and finally the apple ducking water. "You mean to tell me they really all turned to chocolate?" Mr. Midas asked. "You're sure you didn't imagine some of this?" "Oh, no," John assured him. "Well," Mr. Midas said, still looking doubtful, "we're only a couple of blocks from that candy store of yours. Not that I've ever noticed one there. Suppose we stroll over there and ask the man whether his chocolates always do strange things to people." "It's on the next corner," John said, recognizing some of the houses on the side street. "Not the next house, not the next house, not the next," he said, "but—" John's voice faded into silence. The corner where he had found the candy store was nothing now but an empty lot, flat, open ground littered with a pile of rusty tin cans and broken bottles around a splintery old sign saying, "For Sale." Said Mr. Midas, frowning anxiously at John. "I think we'd better pay a visit to Dr. Cranium before we go home." "That's where the store was, though," John protested, beginning to cry again. He had shed more tears in that one day, it seemed, and certainly eaten more chocolate than in all the other days of his life put together. "I know it was." Dr. Cranium was a very busy man. As luck would have it, however, he was able to see Mr. Midas and John almost at once. "Well, well, 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 well," said Dr. Cranium. "And how are we getting along now, John? Have we cut down on our candy, eh?" "How do you do?" John responded dully. "Apparently he's had a bad day, Dr. Cranium," Mr. Midas said. "Trouble at school, you know, and a little accident at a birthday party. What I'm worried about is that he keeps saying that everything he puts into his mouth turns to chocolate." "No more than a nursery fantasy, I'm sure," Dr. Cranium said to Mr. Midas. "Well, John," he went on, looking down with a smile, "suppose you tell me, in your own words, what the matter seems to be." "Everything I put into my mouth turns to chocolate," John explained. "Everything I eat and everything I drink changes into chocolate. I'm thirsty, and I'm getting a pain, a bad one, I think." Dr. Cranium sighed patiently and invited John to open his mouth and say, "Ah." "Ah," John said. Dr. Cranium peered into John's mouth briefly and gave a low whistle of surprise. "This chocolate eating simply must stop." He went to a supply cabinet. "I don't think there's any time to be lost," he told Mr. Midas. "I'm going to give the boy some of my own special compound. Dr. Cranium's elixir, I call it. Never fails. Dr. Cranium selected a large bottle from one of the cabinet's crowded shelves. He removed the top of the bottle. He got a spoon from another shelf. He filled the spoon with an oily, greenish, yellowish medicine that had yellowish, reddish lights glinting in it. It doesn't taste very pleasant, Dr. Cranium warned John in a pleasant tone of voice, but I'm sure it'll do the trick. Clear the stomach and you clear the mind. That's what I always say. Dr. Cranium offered John the brimful spoon. Must I? John asked his father. I know it'll turn into chocolate. Go on, Mr. Midas nodded encouragingly. Drink it down. So, maybe this elixir of Dr. Cranium's is the answer to John's problems. What do you guys think? Do you predict that the medicine will work and John will go back to his regular old self? Or is John stuck with the chocolate touch? So many questions. I have so many thoughts swirling in my head. Well, we will continue with the next 2 chapters after this break. Thank you guys for reading with me.